Welcome to cellular respiration and fermentation. We're going to talk about two sides of the same coin, photosynthesis and mitochondria. Oh wait, I've got a pointer in here somewhere. Ah. So during photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is absorbed, light energy is converted into the energy in the bonds of organic molecules, which is what mitochondria use to create energy in ATP. That electron energy is turned into electron energy in ATP, and then that can be used to do cellular work, including synthesis reactions, muscle contraction. It's the mitochondria that uses oxygen, and we'll talk about how that happens. And photosynthesis releases oxygen. So they're really two sides of the same process. So again, ATP, as we talked about before, is an RNA nucleotide, and it has ribose, adenine, and phosphates. And it's phosphates that are able to hold on to that high energy electron energy that we can use for muscle contraction and for synthesis reactions. So it's the breaking of these two bonds. Sometimes this bond is broken, sometimes this bond is broken, sometimes first this one, then that one. Both of them can release energy to be used to do cellular work. ATP can be used many times. When we see phosphate symbolized by this little pi, that indicates inorganic phosphate. It's inorganic because it's no longer bonded to anything with carbon in it, and it's carbon that makes something an organic molecule. So phosphorus and oxygen by itself is inorganic because there's no carbons bonded to it. But when it's bound to ADP, when ADP gets phosphorylated, now it is organic phosphate in the form of ATP. So mitochondria is where most of this ATP is made. Over 90% of the ATP that's used in our cells is made in the mitochondria, and the mitochondria are the only things in our entire body that uses oxygen. So food molecules, especially glucose, are broken down using oxygen. Carbon dioxide is released. The carbons in the organic molecules end up as the carbons in carbon dioxide. However, as we'll see, the oxygens do not end up in carbon dioxide. The oxygen that we breathe that's used for aerobic respiration, the oxygen ends up in water molecules. And then the energy ends up in ATP. There is heat wasted during this process because no energy conversion is 100% efficient. So oxidation reduction reactions. This will often be abbreviated as redox, R-E-D-O-X. So if you see redox, that just means an oxidation and reduction reaction. These are very important biological reactions, and they involve electron energy. So we use these two little sayings to help us remember what happens during the oxidation part of the reaction and the reduction part of the reaction. So oxidation means losing, reduction means gaining. And it's easy to see what's happening when there's an electron actually moving, as in the case when sodium and chlorine react to form sodium chloride salt. We actually have sodium losing an electron and becoming positively charged, and chlorine gaining an electron and becoming chloride ion. So oxidation means losing. So the thing that gets oxidized is whatever lost an electron. Reduction means gaining. So the thing that gained an electron, that's what was reduced. And it isn't always this obvious what gets oxidized and what gets reduced, because there isn't always a change of charge in organic oxidation reduction reactions. And always there's both. So if one thing is being oxidized, the other thing is being reduced. Sometimes it's much easier to figure out one of the things in a reaction. So if you can tell one thing that's being oxidized or one thing that's being reduced, that means you can figure out the other one. and this is just generalized. So something that's losing an electron here, so E minus, that's an electron. Something that's losing an electron, that's what's being oxidized. Something that's gaining an electron, that's what's being reduced. So here's a more typical organic reaction where we don't see a change in charge. So that makes it harder to tell where the electrons are moving. The fact that we have oxygen involved with a lot of organic reactions, though, does simplify it, because if something gains bonds to oxygen, generally that's what's being oxidized. So here we have methane. Methane is the gas that's mostly what natural gas is made out of. So if you're using gas for heating or gas to cook on your stove, it's mostly methane. Each carbon to hydrogen bond has stored electron energy, and it's the same kind of energy that is found in the carbon-hydrogen bonds in a glucose molecule or in a fatty acid that we use for energy. So we can burn methane in the presence of oxygen, and it produces carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So again, remember that the oxygens here end up in water during respiration. Okay, so now there's no charge change. So what's happening here? So the carbons were oxidized, and that's because when something gains a bond to oxygen, it has lost control of the electrons, because oxygen, remember, is electronegative. It's an electron hog. So when something gains a bond to oxygen, the oxygen is going to hog the electrons. Oxidation is losing of electrons. So now down here we have the Lewis structure so that you can see the electrons a little bit better. So in methane, carbon and hydrogen share the electrons equally. And in oxygen as well, in oxygen gas, the two oxygen molecule atoms are equally powerful, and so they're sharing the electrons equally. However, in carbon dioxide, carbon has lost the electrons here, because oxygen now is the electron hog. It's going to hold most of the electrons. And water as well. So these hydrogens end up in water. They now have also lost their electrons. Oxygen has gained electrons. Reduction is gaining. So the oxygen got reduced because it gained electrons, and the carbon was oxidized. And so and this is exactly what happens during burning of a glucose molecule. So here we have glucose burning in the presence of oxygen here and producing carbon dioxide and water. So the carbon to oxygen bonds in a glucose, remember each carbon in a carbohydrate generally has one bond at least to an oxygen, sometimes two. Those carbon to oxygen bonds don't have any stored energy, because anytime you have electrons associated with an electronegative element like oxygen or nitrogen, they're going to be at the lowest energy level with no potential energy in them. So the bonds here that have energy are the carbon to hydrogen bonds and the carbon-carbon bonds found in a glucose molecule. So here we have these carbons are all fully oxidized in carbon dioxide. So all of the carbon to carbon bonds and the carbon to hydrogen bonds have been completely oxidized to oxygen bonds. And that means all that energy, that's where this energy comes from. It's from these electrons going from a high energy state down to a low energy state. That's where the energy comes from. So things becoming oxidized, generally they are reducing in energy. Electrons that become associated with oxygen, both in carbon dioxide and water, are in the lowest energy state possible. So carbon dioxide and water both have no harvestable energy. That's why both of these things are stable molecules, because they are at a low energy state, whereas glucose is much less stable because it has electrons at a higher energy state. And you can get it to react with things more easily. So to move around this electron energy in a cell, we need to have a molecule that's capable of holding on to high energy electrons without allowing them to fall down to a low energy state. And here's one of our electron carriers, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Well, we're just going to call it NAD. And in its oxidized state, it's NAD+. When it's carrying 2 electrons and hydrogens just come along for the ride, it's NADH. So whenever you see a reaction where part of the reaction is a conversion of NAD+ to NADH, this is a reduction. So NAD+ to NADH, NAD+ got reduced to NADH. That means something else in the reaction was oxidized when you see that as part of a reaction. So NAD can grab 2 high energy electrons and carry them to the electron transport chain, where they can be used, as we'll see, to make ATP. So here we have one of the carbons in a carbohydrate. There's a bond to oxygen already, and then we have other bonds here, which could be to another carbon or to a hydrogen, and our hydrogen with its electron here. So NAD is in the oxidized state here. It's going to be reduced. So that means the other thing gets oxidized, and we can see that here carbon has 1 bond to oxygen. Here it has 2 bonds to oxygen. So carbon was oxidized because it lost electrons, even though there's no charge change. So it lost control of these electrons here. So here it's sharing them equally. Here it is not. Oxygen is going to be hogging them. So there's our oxidation reaction. So this got oxidized, NAD was reduced to NADH. But now it's still, those electrons are still high energy. So it is capable of holding on to a pair of high energy electrons, which it can then carry to the electron transport chain. So what the electron transport chain does in the mitochondria is it allows energy to be released in a slow fashion so it can be used to do work. So if we burn hydrogen gas with oxygen, that's what they use to power the space shuttle. It's a very explosive reaction. Here we have electrons in hydrogen gas at a very high energy level. Water, they're at the lowest energy level. This energy release is an explosion. But our cells cannot have an explosion to release energy. So instead, these high energy electrons are allowed to step down in energy, one little step at a time. And that energy then is used to do work, which ultimately is going to result in ATP synthesis from ADP. And that's really what cellular respiration is doing. It's taking high energy electrons, moving them around, allowing them to step down in energy so that we can convert most of it into ATP. And GTP is going to be a secondary product of this reaction as well. So the electron transport chain allows electrons to fall down to the lowest energy level, and this is the step that uses oxygen. The electron transport chain in our mitochondria is the only thing in our bodies that uses oxygen. And this is in fact what fails when you die from lack of oxygen. It's the electron transport chain in your mitochondria that is not drawing those electrons down the electron transport chain. The amount of ATP being synthesized by your cells drops off dramatically, and that's what does you in from lack of oxygen. So the electrons are drawn down this electron transport chain, sort of like electrons moving in a circuit. And when oxygen is present, oxygen drags the electrons off of the end of that circuit and allows the electrons to flow. And without oxygen, the electrons don't flow. Just like if you have a wire that's broken in a circuit, the electrons don't flow in that circuit. So we'll talk about the 3 steps here in cellular respiration. First, glycolysis, which takes place in the cytoplasm and does not use oxygen. Then pyruvate oxidation and oxidative phosphorylation. Both of these take place in the mitochondria.